The last thing Mirella heard before the screaming began was the thunder of hooves across the Dothraki sea, a sound like the earth itself splitting open to swallow the world whole. She had been drawing water from the stone well in the courtyard of her family's villa when the horizon darkened. Not with clouds, but with riders, thousands upon thousands of them, their hair braided with bells that sang a song of conquest across the grasslands. The Dothraki came like a plague of locusts, and they left nothing behind but ash, broken stone, and silence. But for the women they took, silence would have been a mercy. If you're drawn to the darkest corners of history and the untold stories that shaped civilizations, follow this channel. Subscribe and join us as we uncover what the past tried to bury. The Dothraki were not merely warriors. They were a force of nature, a culture built entirely upon the philosophy of strength, conquest, and the absolute subjugation of the weak. To understand what befell the women they captured, one must first understand the world from which these riders emerged. A world where mercy was not just absent, but considered a weakness worthy of death. The Dothraki sea stretched endlessly beneath a sky so vast it seemed to crush the soul. It was a realm of tall grass that whispered secrets in the wind, of wild horses that ran free until they were broken, of khals who ruled through violence and vision. Here, in this ocean of green and gold, the Dothraki had built an empire without walls, without cities, without anything permanent except their traditions, and those traditions were written in blood. When a Dothraki Khalazar descended upon a settlement, it was not war in any conventional sense. It was harvest. The men were slaughtered where they stood, their bodies left to feed the carrion birds that followed the great hordes like a second shadow. The children, some were taken, some were killed, depending on the whim of the khal. The elderly were shown no quarter. They had no value in a society that worshipped strength above all else. But the women were never killed. At first, to the uninitiated, this might seem like mercy. It was not. Mirella was 23 years old when the Dothraki came to her village on the edge of the disputed lands between the free cities and the great grass sea. She had been promised to a merchant's son, a marriage that would secure her family's fortune and her own future. She had dreams, modest dreams perhaps, but they were hers. She would have children, manage a household, grow old watching the sun set over the bay. The Dothraki took those dreams and ground them into dust beneath their horses' hooves. When the raiders broke through the villa's gates, Mirella's father tried to defend his home with a ceremonial sword that had not seen battle in 3 generations. A Dothraki screamer cut him down with casual efficiency, the curved arak opening him from shoulder to hip in a single, terrible motion. Her mother's screams ended abruptly when another rider drove his blade through her throat. Mirella ran. She ran through corridors she had known since childhood, past tapestries she had helped her mother weave, through gardens where she had played as a girl. But there was nowhere to run. The Dothraki had surrounded the villa, and their blood riders were already dragging women from every corner of the compound. A hand, calloused, strong, smelling of horse and leather and blood, clamped around her wrist. Mirella was yanked backward with such force that she felt something tear in her shoulder. She looked up into the face of her captor, a man whose skin was the color of burnished copper, whose eyes held no emotion whatsoever, whose braided hair hung past his waist, each bell in it representing a victory she did not want to imagine. He said something in a language she did not understand, then threw her across his saddle like a sack of grain. The world became a blur of motion and terror as the horse galloped away from everything she had ever known. The Khalazar moved constantly, a city of horses and warriors that flowed across the grasslands like a river of violence. Mirella lost count of the days. One bled into the next, each marked only by the rising and setting of the sun and the unending rhythm of the horses beneath her. She was not alone. There were dozens of other women, all taken from settlements along the Dothraki's path of conquest. They came from different cities, spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, But they all wore the same expression, the hollow-eyed stare of those who had seen the worst humanity could offer and knew they would see worse still. The Dothraki did not cage them. They did not need to. Where would they run? In every direction, the grass stretched to the horizon. No landmarks, no roads, no sanctuary. The few women who tried to escape were brought back within hours, dragged behind horses until their bodies were broken and bleeding. Then they were thrown back among the other captives as a lesson. But running was not the worst fate. Not even close. The breaking there is a concept in Dothraki culture called arach dothralat, the way of the curved blade. It means more than swordsmanship. It means the breaking and remaking of a thing until it serves its purpose. They applied this philosophy to horses, to enemies, and most thoroughly to the women they captured. The women were not treated as prisoners. They were treated as resources, as property, as less than human. The Dothraki did not see them as people with names, histories, and dreams. They saw them as vessels, for pleasure, for labor, for bearing children who would grow up to be warriors. Each woman was assigned to a warrior. Some were given to blood riders, the Khal's most trusted men. Some were distributed among the regular screamers. The most beautiful were reserved for the Khal himself, to be added to his collection of wives and concubines. But beauty was no protection. If anything, it made the horror worse. Mirella was given to a warrior named Koro. He was not cruel by Dothraki standards, which meant he did not beat her daily, only when she displeased him. He did not brand her with hot iron, though many of the other women were marked as property. He did not cut off her fingers or toes as punishment for minor infractions, as she saw done to others. Instead, he broke her in subtler ways. Every night, in the tent that smelled of smoke and horse sweat and grass, Koro would take what he wanted. There was no tenderness, no consideration, no acknowledgement that Mirella was a living being with thoughts and feelings. She was an object to be used, and use her he did. When she cried, he ignored her. When she resisted, he held her down with effortless strength. When she finally learned to remain silent and still, hoping to make it end faster, he seemed to prefer it that way. But the nights were not the worst part. The nights ended. The days were eternal. During the day, the captive women were put to work. They cooked the meals, great pots of horse meat stew that bubbled over fires that never went out. They tanned hides, turning the raw skins of slaughtered animals into the leather that would become armor, saddles, and clothing. They wove grass into mats and baskets. They hauled water from streams and rivers. They tended to the horses, the sacred animals that were more valued than any human woman. The work was backbreaking, endless, performed under the contemptuous gaze of Dothraki women, the wives and daughters of warriors who had been born into the horde. These women were only slightly higher in status than the captives, but they lorded that small advantage with vicious glee. They would strike the slaves with sticks for working too slowly. They would pour dirty water over food the captives had spent hours preparing, forcing them to start over. They would laugh and make crude jokes about which of the captive women would be used and discarded that night. But even this casual cruelty was not the worst part. The worst part was watching women forget who they had been. Mirella met a woman named Sara, who had been taken 3 years earlier from a farming village in the disputed lands. Sara had once been a weaver, renowned for her skill with complex patterns and dyes. Now her hands were scarred and calloused, her back bent from carrying water. She no longer remembered the names of her children, whether she had 2 or 3, whether they had been boys or girls. The Dothraki had not stolen her memories with any deliberate act. They had simply made survival so consuming, so exhausting, that there was no room left for the past. Sara told Mirella, in a voice devoid of emotion, "You will forget too. It's easier when you forget. The ones who remember, they don't last." She was right. Mirella saw women who held on to their identities, who whispered their names to themselves at night, who tried to maintain some fragment of who they had been. They were the ones who broke completely. Some went mad, speaking to people who weren't there, laughing at nothing. Some stopped eating, slowly starving themselves until their bodies gave out. Some simply walked into the grass one night and never came back. Whether they died of exposure or were killed by predators, no one knew or cared. The Dothraki did not mourn the loss of slaves. There were always more to be taken. And then there were the children. Not all the captive women died or went mad or forgot. Some survived. Some adapted. Some even bore children to their captors, not by choice, but by the inevitable mathematics of their situation. And these children were raised as Dothraki, taught to ride before they could walk, taught that strength was virtue and mercy was weakness, taught to despise the very mothers who bore them if those mothers came from the conquered peoples. Mirella watched as a woman named Lysa gave birth in a tent with no midwife, no help except from other slaves who knew nothing of childbirth. The baby, a son, was taken from her before he was even cleaned. He was given to a Dothraki woman who could not conceive, and Lysa was sent back to work the next day, still bleeding, still torn from the delivery. When she tried to approach the child weeks later, she was beaten unconscious. The child grew up calling another woman mother. He learned to ride. He learned to fight. And one day, when he was perhaps 5 or 6 years old, Mirella saw him ride past the slaves section of the camp. Lysa reached out to him, called to him in the language she had spoken before the Dothraki came. The boy, her son, spat at her and called her a weak slave in perfect Dothraki. Lysa hanged herself that night using a leather cord. No one cut her down until morning. There was one path that some captive women eventually took, though it was not truly an escape. When a Khal died, his wives, all of them, both those who had been Dothraki-born and those who had been taken as slaves, were sent to Vice Dothrak, the only permanent settlement of the Dothraki people. There, they became part of the Dosh Khaleen, the council of widowed Khaleesi who served in the Great Temple and supposedly advised future Khals. To outsiders, this might seem like retirement, perhaps even a position of honor. But Mirella learned the truth from an older woman who had once served a Dosh Khaleen member in Vice Dothrak. The widows were forbidden from ever leaving the sacred city. They could not remarry. They could not love. They could not have any life beyond the temple walls. They existed in a state of permanent liminality, neither slave nor free, neither dead nor truly alive. For a woman who had been taken from her home, broken and used by warriors, stripped of her identity, and forced to bear children to her captors, this was the best fate she could hope for. To spend her remaining years locked in a sacred prison, praying to a horse god and pretending to have influence she did not possess. As Mirella's first year with the Khalazar drew to a close, she finally understood the full, horrifying truth of her situation. The Dothraki did not capture women for pleasure alone, though they took that freely. They did not capture women for labor alone, though they worked them to exhaustion. They captured women to erase them. Every woman taken from a city or village represented a future that would never exist. Children who would never be born into their mother's culture. Traditions that would never be passed down, languages that would lose speakers with each generation. The Dothraki were not content to simply conquer. They sought to make conquest permanent by consuming the defeated people entirely, leaving no seed from which resistance might grow. The men they killed quickly because dead men could not fight back, but the women they kept alive because living women could be forced to bear Dothraki children, could be made to serve Dothraki purposes, could be transformed into tools of their own culture's extinction. It was genocide by assimilation, performed one captured woman at a time. On a night when the grass whispered with unusual violence and the stars seemed too bright, too accusing, Mirella sat by a dying fire and tried to remember her mother's face. She found she could not. The features were blurred now, indistinct. She could not remember the exact color of her mother's eyes, could not recall the melody of the lullaby she had sung when Mirella was young. The forgetting had begun. Beside her, another woman, taken from a different city, speaking a different language, began to weep silently. She was perhaps 16, had been captured only a month ago. She still had all her memories, still felt all her pain. Mirella wanted to comfort her, to tell her something that would ease the horror, but there was nothing to say that would not be a lie. So instead, Mirella whispered the only truth that mattered. Remember your name. For as long as you can, remember your name. The girl looked at her with eyes that had already begun to hollow out and whispered back, "What was yours?" Mirella opened her mouth to answer and found that she had to think about it. For a moment. Just for one terrible, endless moment. That was when she knew she was lost. The Dothraki Khalazar moved on the next morning, as it always did, as it always would. Behind them, the grass slowly covered the churned earth where they had camped. Within a week, there would be no sign they had ever been there. The women they carried with them had no such luxury. They could not be erased by time or weather. They walked in daylight, worked under the sun, bore children who would grow up to be warriors who would capture other women from other cities. The cycle continued, eternal and terrible, until the line between victim and participant became so blurred that it ceased to have meaning. In the cities of the West, people told stories about the Dothraki, stories of savage riders who feared nothing, who could not be defeated, who came like a storm and left like a curse. They spoke of the warriors' prowess, their horsemanship, their martial culture, but they did not speak of the women whose disappearance was considered a tragedy only until the next harvest, the next trade deal, the next political marriage, the women who were forgotten by their own people, almost as thoroughly as they forgot themselves. The Dothraki did not kill these women. That would have been mercy. Instead, they unmade them, piece by piece, by memory, until nothing remained of who they had been except a body that continued to function, continued to serve, continued to exist in a state that was somehow worse than death, because death is an ending. What the Dothraki did to captured women had no ending at all. The grass of the Dothraki sea grows tall and green each spring. It feeds the horses, it hides the dead, and it whispers nothing about the women who walk among it, whose names are lost, whose stories are untold, whose suffering is as vast and endless as the sea itself.